and where to begin. First, I suppose I ought to say where I bought this. I went to an auction and bought the papers from a rest home that had once been a house for the insane. I have no idea the date or the status of the paper. A doctor said seen, at least I assume it's a doctor's handwriting on it, and a date 1953. But how old the paper is itself, I do not know. Who wrote it, I do not know, except they were English. And I bought the paper in France, near I live. I found it in a bricante in Foix. They were selling it as a curio. And bizarre. But beyond that, I know nothing. It seems to be a statement written by an English patient, I would guess, in some sort of hospital in France. But see what you think it is. I and my wife, Anne, we took this maison, this villa, down right in the south of France, where we hadn't been for many a year, down nestling in the Pyrenees. It was a village that was up one of those steep valleys, all woods and torrents or river, where you get a village on the very knees of the mountains, with a church that rings over the valleys. And it was far too cheap, really cheap. For 3 months it was ludicrous. Where we wasn't exactly popular, I could see that, and we were going to be there October, November and December. But even so, it was too cheap. My wife worried about it as we drove south, saying, how do we know what it's like? What sort of idiots are we to take a house that we've never seen before? Who knows what sort of ghosts it could have in it? And I did what I always did at that time. I laughed at her. Anyway, on the last day, they were going to arrive. It was October, and we had forgotten how the light worked in France. The evening came quickly, and I was driving the last few miles in the dark. And it was strange. It was a forest land, a land where you plunged down into the valleys and up again. And as you went down into the valleys, it was always wooded. And as we got closer and closer to where I was sure the village would be, the woods grew more and more dense, and so did the fog. And then at last, it was so dense that even my fog lights were of little use. I could see nothing ahead of me. When suddenly Anne said, "Stop!" For there was a figure, standing in the road, looking at us, half a smile. A face of utter malevolence. I don't think I've ever seen a more evil-looking person. She was dressed in a black cloak with a black bonnet, and her eyes were sunken, as if she was not alive or dead. We shivered, and I got out of the car, meaning to see if she was needed help. She looked like she needed an institution. But as I closed the door, Anne suddenly screamed, and I turned, and the figure was gone. I looked at the road, and there was nothing. Nothing. So I got back in the car and I tried to start it, and it only started on the third turn, and I was so anxious by then. But it started, and as chance would have it, we were near the end of the wood. And as we drove out of the wood, there were two great yew trees, like gates. I felt like I was going through a mouth. But beyond it, the village lay beyond the mist, and a kilometre or so from the village was our villa. We arrived. It was very big and luxurious, much better than I thought it would be, modern even. And I looked at its windows, and I counted them, working out how many rooms there were there. But I shivered. I shivered to think of it. And my wife suddenly looked out into the forest and said, "She's there! She's hunting! I can see her! Looking at me!" And I said, "That nonsense," because I could see nothing. And I let us in, and we lit the electricity, which snapped on. And I brought out the valises, and I took them upstairs, and there was food laid out, and we soon had jambon and patate, and some local wine that had been left. I had arranged with the agent, you see, to leave us food. And with bread, we made an excellent dinner. And it wasn't a cold night, so we went up to the room that we had chosen to sleep in. And as I closed the door, my wife shivered one more time and said, "How do we know they're not out there? She's not out there. The woman, I mean. The woman in the fog." And I said, "Well, I've locked the doors. What more do you want me to have done?" And then she stretched out to go to sleep. And maybe it was the wine, but she went to sleep very, very easily. Me, far less so. Far, far less so. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I heard outside a rustle like a skirt was rustling against the door. I looked at the handle. It looked like the door was being closed with a snick. Well, I got up. Luckily, I travel with a cane, a walking stick with a heavy, heavy end. So I got that ready with me, and I ran to the door and I opened it. But gently, because I didn't want to scare my wife in case it was nothing, just rats or imagination. And I looked down the staircase that was right by the door. And at the bottom, I saw something. Against the light that the moon shone from the great window down the bottom of a blind passageway that seemed to go nowhere, that we'd noted as we'd come in, I saw a figure, tall, wearing black, the same cloak, the same bonnet. Well, I ran as fast as I could and as silent as I could down the staircase, meaning to have a word. After all, it could just be the owner of the place. We dealt with an agent. It could be the owner, come back to see what we were like. I had heard as much in France. I wouldn't blame them. But by the time I was down the bottom of the stairs, no one was there. No one. So there was nothing for me to do but go back upstairs, go back into bed, and hope my wife was not distressed by it. Now in the morning we got up, and I was jumpy, which was strange for me, because I'm normally content where I am. And it was my wife who seemed unnaturally happy and said, "This is a wonderful place. I want to stay here always." And it was true, the light was shining in, that warm, rich light you get in the south of France in October. And beyond we saw the forests and the mountains. I could see why she would be happy. But given the house was making me feel queer, and she was more prone to that than I did wonder. Anyway, I asked her what she wanted to do, and she said she wanted to explore the house more than anything. Well, I looked out in the sunlight, and I wondered why she didn't want to have breakfast outside, but we had it indoors. And then we went all through the house. It had 3 layers. Upstairs, where we were sleeping, right at the top, were the best views. Downstairs there was that long corridor where the moon had shone. And my wife insisted we went down it. Oh, I didn't like the look of it. As I was going down it, suddenly I stopped. A pair of living eyes looked out from a dark end of the corridor before the window, unlit by the window. A pair of dark living eyes looked out. And I said, "What's that?" And my wife smiled, drawing back the curtain more so that I could see. There was a picture. And she said, "Oh, she looks kinder in the drawing." And it was true. Both of us recognized the woman. This was a woman in the mist. But her face was less hard. Her eyes had the kind look almost of my wife. Almost. She looked kinder than the figure I had seen the night before, that I hadn't told my wife about, ever so slightly, and her chin was slightly more round. Strange, in that light my wife looked harder. But anyway, I said, "Well, that explains it. We'll go to the agent this afternoon. And I'll ask what's happening. Obviously the previous lady who owned the house is around, and we ought to go and meet her." So we had lunch and went down to the village. And I went, and after some inquiry, I found the little bungalow in which the agent lived. And he gave me some of the local wine, and he looked at me and said, "Are you unhappy in the house? What is wrong?" "What is wrong, monsieur?" And I said, "No, I'm perfectly happy in the house. I wondered why it was so cheap." Because that was what the woman who owns it, the widow, told me to 2 years ago. And she's never told me to rise the price. "Oh, has there been many tenants?" "Oh, yes. Oh, yes. We let it twice a year for 3 months. And I set it all up. I take the money, I take my commission, and I'm done." "Isn't the widow around here somewhere?" I could have sworn that was her picture at the end of the corridor. And then we saw her in the mist. I think I saw her in the house. No, monsieur. The widow is no more. Is she dead? No more around here to be seen, by day or by night, said the agent adamantly. Well, after he said that, I wondered what he meant. But he would say no more, only asked me whether I was content in the place to stay, and I was beginning to think that I wanted to leave. But when I came out, I met my wife, who had been talking to the women in the village. Her French is much better than mine, and seemed so happy and so content that I knew I couldn't leave. Not without a scene. Not after I had taken us there. Well, as we went home, the cloud began to build. It was hot and sticky. A storm, I thought. For I knew the storms blew in quickly from the mountains. And indeed, the agent had muttered that he thought there would be a storm, sans pleurs, without rain. Which was a new thought to me, but I know the weather in the mountains is strange. It was after midnight when the first streak of lightning woke me up with a jolt. I looked, and my eyes were filled with white light, and then there was a sound, hard, long. The thunder was close, and again, 3 times. My wife was asleep, and strangely, the only one awake. So I crept over to the window, because I like a good storm, and I looked down into the garden. And there was a woman. black robe with a black hat. And a face I almost knew. I could see lightning strike on lightning strike. It looked more and more like one I couldn't place, and less like the one I'd seen at first. But I couldn't see her properly. So I thought, if I go down to the window below, the end of the long corridor, I'll get to have a look at her, and then I'll see where she goes. So I went down along the corridor, all the way the lightning struck again and again and again, lighting the world, so I didn't need to light a torch. I came at last to the end. I looked down. There was the lawn. There was the woman looking up. Eyes almost kind, face strangely rounder. But she didn't move at all, and I wondered what to do next. I turned, thinking that I would go back out and have a word with her, and suddenly I caught sight of the picture. The woman it was missing. I swear it, she was missing. I saw her by the lightning. The lightning without rain. Then I turned back to look at the lawn, but she was gone. The storm was beginning to ebb. I didn't fancy searching in the dark. So I went back to bed. I didn't sleep very well. Slept in the next day. My wife woke me up, and the first thing I did, I went down to have a look at the picture. And there was the old woman in the black cloak, her face looking strangely benevolent. I went back to my wife and said, "We must leave here." And she looked at me adamantly, almost fiercely, and said, "No, I want to stay. I'm happy here. I am happy here. I only wish I could always stay." I only wish I could always stay. And she looked at me with a strange look in her eyes that I thought was odd. But I knew that her father had been French, and that she was very happy in France, and we hadn't come this way for many a year. So I agreed that we would stay. And after breakfast I went down to the vineyard, and it was beautiful. All warm lights and folk harvesting. And one woman gave me some grapes, and they were so sweet. I was just turning to go when a little old man hobbled up to me and said, "You've taken the villa. The agent told me." And I said, "Yes." And he smiled and said, "Do you know the story of the owner of the villa? The man who bought it, built it?" "A man?" I rather thought it was a woman who owned it. "Ah, that was Madame Cousson, but it was built by her husband, who was much older than her, Monsieur. And they lived in it for nearly 20 years. Now, I'm not saying that it was an unhappy marriage, but it was clear that the Madame thought that the Monsieur was not up to the husband's part, and there was always gossip in the village about who she had stepped out with next. And the old man seemed to tolerate it for a long time. But as I remember talking to him, sometimes there was a look of bitterness in his eyes, as if, for all his toleration, he was growing vexed. One summer, he had his wife painted in a particular apparel, as if she was already a widow. "By which painter?" "I think I know the painting, along the end of the corridor with the blind corridor with the window." "Yes, that's the one." "I don't know. We never knew his name. He arrived late, worked by night, and I didn't see his face. He was gone at the end of a week. And there was the portrait, both lovely and hideous. and Madame Cusson hated it and put it at the end of that corridor. I would never go near it and never look at it. I heard her once mutter to herself, "My death lies in that corridor. My death lies in that portrait. But I. Well, very soon after, suspiciously soon, Monsieur Cusson grew ill. Some said he must have been poisoned. Certainly the doctor could find no poison, but he could find no cause for the illness either. I was with Monsieur and Madame. I worked on the estate in those days. As he was ailing, and the doctor whispered to me, "He's likely to die." And I would know whether he'd been poisoned. "I trust you. Ask him before the end, Jack." And so I asked him, and the old man said nothing, only, "My wife will not escape as easily as she thinks, for the house holds on to its own." Well, by his will, he was buried at the end of the garden, down by the old yew tree. And what happened to the wife? Ah, the wife. People saw her for a week or so, and she wore now exactly the clothes of the portrait. And then nobody saw her. Was she dead? No. Was she gone? Left? No, property was gone. It was as if she disappeared. She was never seen in the body again. What do you mean? Many people say they've seen her floating in the woods, that they've seen her in the house, as if she was a living ghost, with dark eyes, hunting. Hunting? Oh yes. Do you not know the charm? Her soul is caught in that painting, and her body and soul cannot return until she's found another to take her place. When he said that, a bolt of fear ran through me. I left him. I ran back to the house. I ran down the corridor, up the stairs and along the blind corridor, and I looked at the picture, and at first I thought, "Oh, it's fine, it's wearing the black cloak." The eyes were just kinder than I thought. The chin was rounder. I called for my wife, and there was no answer. And I looked at the picture, and I realized it had become my wife. Just then, I heard the front door handle begin to move. I ran down. I looked through the glass in the door. I saw the figure. The figure to open the door. I knew who it would be! At that point, I'm afraid the manuscript breaks off. You can see the writer broke his pen, and I know nothing more. Who was mad? And what happened then? Whether his wife was really gone? Nothing. But it is an interesting tale nonetheless. I think you'll agree.